All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. Uganda's brand new guidelines for prosecutors. We've got some excerpts here from a Ugandan news article. It's from The Monitor. And we've even got selections from the actual guidelines document itself. Guidelines on the decision to charge 2023. Ever wonder what actually determines whether or not someone gets charged with a crime? Well, in Uganda, they've got a whole system for that now.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating look into how a country's values and priorities get reflected in their approach to justice. I mean, what I find so fascinating is this intersection of law, ethics, and societal expectations all coming together.
It's true. And I think having both the news coverage and the actual guidelines gives us a really cool perspective on it. The Monitor article talks about how the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, the ODPP, put these guidelines out to try to make charging decisions more consistent and fair.
Yeah, and that push for fairness and transparency, I mean, that's so important for public trust in the system. Plus, just practically speaking, it helps keep the courts from being totally bogged down with weaker cases.
For sure. And, the DPP, Jane Frances Abadoh, she even said there are high costs for society if prosecutors don't do their job properly.
That's a pretty strong statement.
It is.
It really speaks to the weight of prosecutorial discretion, that power to decide who gets charged and for what. These guidelines are really all about guiding that discretion and making sure it's used responsibly.
So how does it all actually work? Like, how do they actually put this into practice?
Well, the guidelines lay out two main tests that prosecutors must consider before they charge someone. First up, you've got the evidential test.
Which, that one's pretty straightforward. Is there enough solid evidence to likely get a conviction? Look at things like, is the evidence reliable? Are the witnesses credible? How strong is the evidence itself? Yeah, it makes sense. You wouldn't want to clog up the system with cases that are probably going to fail right from the start. But then it gets really interesting with the public interest test. So even if there is enough evidence, is it really the right move to actually prosecute?
Exactly. That's where those societal values we were talking about earlier really come into play. The guidelines list a whole bunch of factors under what they call public interest. For example, they consider the seriousness of the offense.
Well, I guess my question is, how do you measure how serious something is? A crime is a crime, right?
Well, yeah, but it's more nuanced than that. The guidelines actually consider things like, was the crime premeditated? Did the person who committed it, did they get something out of it? What about the victim? Were they particularly vulnerable? All of those things get factored in.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting how they factor in the impact on the community, too. And community isn't always just about location. It could be any group with shared traits or experiences.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine like a fraud case that's specifically targeting elderly people. That has a devastating impact not only on the victims themselves, but also on the sense of security within that entire elderly community. So it's that ripple effect that they're trying to capture.
I see. So they're not just looking at the immediate crime itself. They're really thinking about those long-term consequences, too.
Exactly. It's about looking at the bigger picture.
There's also this factor of proportionality, too. It's like, is the cost of actually going through with the prosecution worth the potential outcome?
Right, and that IS in there. But the guidelines are really careful to say that, cost IS a factor. But it shouldn't be the deciding one. The emphasis is still on all those other public interest considerations.
Okay. And then they have a whole section on special cases, which is really interesting because it emphasizes how to handle cases that involve children. It really seems like they're trying to look out for the best interests of kids.
Yeah, it reflects a broader shift we're seeing in how society views young offenders, I think. There's a recognition that they're still developing and they need to be treated differently within the justice system.
Yeah, for sure. And then, on top of all of that, to make things even more complex, there's something called the threshold test.
Right, so this one applies to certain serious crimes where there's some evidence, but investigators need a little bit more time to build a really solid case. So think of things like terrorism, election violence, really serious cases of sexual assault. These are situations where public safety is absolutely paramount.
So it's kind of like, we know we need to act now, but we're still trying to gather all the pieces.
Exactly. But to be clear, the guidelines lay out very specific conditions that have to be met in order to use this test. It's not just a free pass to charge anyone.
I see. And it sounds like even if someone is charged under this threshold test, there's still a lot of review involved.
Oh, absolutely. The case can actually be dropped if that additional evidence just doesn't materialize. They really emphasize continuous reassessment.
Okay, so that covers those two main tests. But the guidelines don't stop there. They also touch on things like how to handle guilty pleas and how to use alternative solutions like diversion programs.
It's a really holistic approach to prosecutorial decision-making, I think. It's way more than just deciding guilty or not guilty.
This is really fascinating.
Yeah.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, but it's already clear there's a lot to unpack here. So definitely stick with us as we continue to dive into these new guidelines.
Yeah, there's a lot more to uncover.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in exploring what these guidelines might mean for the future of justice in Uganda.
Yeah, for sure. We're back and still digging into these Ugandan prosecution guidelines. One thing that really strikes me is just how much they're trying to balance all these different interests. You've got public safety on the one hand, you've got the rights of the accused on the other, and then you've got all these societal values kind of mixed in there too.
Yeah, it's definitely a balancing act, and the guidelines seem particularly concerned with preventing bias in decision-making. I mean, they even explicitly state that things like someone's race, their gender, religion, social status, those things cannot be a factor in the decision.
Wow.
And they even call out political considerations, too.
Yeah, that feels significant.
It is. Prosecutorial independence, the idea that prosecutors are making decisions based on the law and the facts, not political pressure, that's really crucial for a fair justice system.
For sure. And they're really doubling down on transparency too.
Yeah.
Every decision, whether it's to charge or not to charge, has to have written reasons backing it up.
That's a great way to ensure accountability. It forces prosecutors to really think through their decisions, and it provides a record that can be reviewed later if needed.
Hopefully that leads to more public trust in the whole system.
I think that's the goal. But it's important to remember that these are still just guidelines. They're not like ironclad rules. There's always room for interpretation. And those judgment calls, ultimately, those are still coming from human beings.
So even with the best guidelines in the world, you still need skilled and ethical prosecutors applying them.
Exactly. That's why training and ongoing professional development is so important.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes you think. One thing that jumped out at me was the emphasis on communication. Like, even if a prosecutor decides not to press charges, they're still supposed to talk it over with the investigating officer.
It's about making sure everyone's on the same page and ensuring that even if it didn't end in charges, that the investigation was as thorough as possible.
Right, right. And they also talk about keeping victims informed throughout the process.
Absolutely. Victims deserve to be treated with respect and compassion. They have a right to understand what's happening with their case.
It makes you wonder, do these Ugandan guidelines have any lessons for other countries? I mean, are there some kind of universal principles here that could apply in other places too?
I think so. I think those core ideas of fairness, transparency, proportionality, those are relevant to any justice system.
Yeah, it does make you curious about how other countries handle this whole prosecutorial discretion thing. Do they have similarly detailed guidelines?
It really varies. Some countries have very strict rules. Others rely more on tradition and precedent. It's a fascinating area to explore further.
Agreed. But for now, let's get back to Uganda. So we've covered a lot. The context, those two main tests, the focus on fairness and transparency.
But there's more. We haven't even touched on those alternative approaches to prosecution that we saw in the guidelines. It seems like Uganda is really trying to think beyond just incarceration.
Yeah, the guidelines mention things like diversion programs, but what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, imagine like a young person who gets caught shoplifting. Instead of automatically going through the court system, they might be diverted to a program where they do some community service. Or maybe they make amends to the store owner directly.
So it's about giving people, especially young people, a second chance.
Precisely. And by addressing the root causes of the behavior, hopefully you can prevent them from reoffending down the road.
That makes sense. The guidelines also mention things like apologies and reconciliation between the victim and the offender. That seems pretty progressive.
It is. It's a recognition that justice can sometimes involve healing and restoring relationships, not just punishment.
But I imagine that only works in certain types of cases.
Right. It wouldn't be appropriate for cases involving serious violence, or where there's a big power imbalance between the victim and the offender.
Of course, yeah. You wouldn't want to pressure a victim into reconciling with someone who seriously harmed them.
Exactly. The victim's well-being always has to come first.
So these alternatives to prosecution, they sound promising. But do we know if they're actually effective?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, data on the effectiveness of these kinds of programs, especially in developing countries, it can be hard to come by.
Yeah, I can imagine. But it seems like it's at least a step in the right direction. It acknowledges that there might be different paths to justice.
Yeah, it challenges that one-size-fits-all mentality.
Wow, these guidelines have really given us a lot to think about.
We've only scratched the surface. It's amazing how we started with these formal legal guidelines and ended up talking about these really big ideas about justice and human nature.
I know, it really shows how even something that seems super technical can spark these really deep conversations.
And it reminds us that justice isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding the human impact of those rules.
I love that. So as we wrap up part 2 here, what's the key takeaway you want listeners to really ponder?
Let's leave them with this question. How do we ensure that these guidelines, which seem well-intentioned, how do we ensure they actually lead to a more just and equitable system in practice? What safeguards do we need to make sure things stay fair and prevent potential bias from creeping in?
That's a great question to keep in mind as we head into the final part of our deep dive. We're back for the final part of our deep dive into Uganda's new prosecution guidelines. And we left off with a really big question. How do we make sure these guidelines, which seem really well-intentioned, how do we make sure they actually make a difference in practice?
Yeah, it's a critical question because, even with really detailed guidelines, there's always that human factor to consider.
Right, right. So how do you actually make sure they're being followed? What's stopping a prosecutor from just making a decision that goes against the guidelines?
Well, the guidelines do mention some internal review processes, but they don't really go into a whole lot of detail. It really hinges on strong leadership within the ODPP and a real culture of ethical conduct.
So there's a lot riding on individual prosecutors actually following the spirit of these guidelines, not just the letter of the law.
Absolutely. And it raises the question of external oversight, too. Is there any way for, the public or watchdog groups to monitor how these guidelines are being applied? That kind of transparency could be really important for building trust.
That's a great point. Transparency and accountability seem so crucial, especially with something as important as prosecutorial decisions. We've talked about all these really positive aims of these guidelines, but could there be any unintended consequences? Could they actually make it harder to prosecute certain types of cases?
It's a valid concern. That emphasis on a realistic prospect of conviction, it could lead some prosecutors to avoid more complex cases, cases where it's harder to guarantee a win.
Especially if prosecutors are really worried about their conviction rates or being seen as soft on crime. It's almost like the guidelines could incentivize them to just go for the easier cases.
Exactly. It highlights this potential tension between following the guidelines and actually making sure that justice is served, even in those really difficult or nuanced cases.
Right, right. And even with all these safeguards in place, can you really eliminate bias completely? Whether it's conscious or unconscious, everyone's bringing their own background and experiences to the table.
That's the ongoing challenge, isn't it? Even with the best guidelines in the world, you still need prosecutors who are not only skilled, but also self-aware and committed to fairness. And they have to be constantly checking their own assumptions.
It makes you realize how much still relies on individual judgment, even in a system that's really trying to standardize things.
It's a good reminder that justice is an ongoing process. It's not just a static set of rules. These guidelines are definitely a step towards a more fair and transparent system, but they're only one piece of a much bigger, more complex puzzle.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening for me. We started with what seemed like a pretty dry legal document, and we ended up talking about these really big ideas about justice, about fairness, even about human nature.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see how something as seemingly technical as these prosecutorial guidelines can spark these kinds of deep philosophical conversations.
All right, so as we wrap up here, what's the one thing you really want our listener to walk away thinking about? What's the most important takeaway from our deep dive?
I think it's this. These new guidelines in Uganda, they represent a really positive step towards a more just system. But their true impact, it's really going to depend on how they're implemented and monitored. True justice requires constant vigilance, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge those assumptions.
That's a great point. Huge thanks to our expert for walking us through this fascinating topic.
It's been my pleasure.
And to you, our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity and gave you a new perspective on the world of justice, not just in Uganda, but everywhere. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged.